If you had been able to make it to the protest today, why did you want to travel all the way to Toronto to be a part of it?
Well, because I've been fighting, the evisceration of civil liberties in the United States for a long time. I sued President Barack Obama over Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which permits the U.S. military overturning over 150 years of law to carry out domestic policing on American city streets, to seize American citizens who, quote-unquote, substantially support the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or something called associated forces, another kind of nebulous phrase, strip them of due process and hold them indefinitely in military facilities. I was also part of the lawsuit that worked its way up to the Supreme Court on warrantless wiretapping. I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. I spent 20 years in some of the most despotic regimes around the globe as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. And I think because of that, understand that this is not the kind of power that you ever want to give to a government. You can't talk about free citizens in a state where everyone has all of their electronic forms of communication not only monitored but stored in perpetuity in government computers. It doesn't matter if they're not using it. History has shown that if the government feels threatened or if they seek greater control, and I think that is the trajectory of the corporate state, they will use it. The goal of wholesale surveillance, and this is something Hannah Arendt wrote about in Origins of Totalitarianism, is not to discover crimes, but to give information to the government that it can use if it decides to arrest a certain category of the population. So I think this is extremely grave, and what I find disturbing is that although the revelations of Edward Snowden are known, we're not reacting. We don't understand the danger that's in front of it. When you talk about a population that is watched and tracked 24 hours a day, I think the relationship between a population that's monitored on that level and those that watch them is the relationship between masters and slaves. You can't even use the word liberty anymore, and we're already at that point. So I don't trust the political parties, courts, the internal mechanisms that once made reform possible to save us. I think we've seen that even with the Snowden revelations and this wholesale surveillance under the U.S. Constitution is patently illegal. We've not had any reaction either by legislative bodies or the courts or anyone else. And I think only through sustained acts of mass civil disobedience do we have any hope of rolling this back. And if we don't roll it back, we're finished.
Right. I wanted to go back to the point you mentioned about that we're not reacting to these sort of bills. What do you think that is? Like, are government sort of training people to be apathetic?
Well, I mean, people are politically passive because they've kind of given up on a system. That's certainly true, more true in the United States, where Congress has a 9% approval rating and only 38% of the population even bothers to cast a ballot anymore. And I think the other thing is they don't quite understand how incredibly dangerous handing any government this kind of power is. So I think it's those two factors, coupled with the fact that our mass radical movements, more so again in the States, but Canada's not immune to this, have been largely broken. Labor unions are under assault. And I find that frightening. I mean, that's why I was willing to fly up here, because if we don't react in a sustained way, then we will see cemented into place one of the most frightening dystopias in human history, something that dwarfs anything ever dreamed of by the communist Stasi state in East Germany, which I covered as a foreign correspondent.
Right. So I guess then, in terms of this particular bill, do you think that this fits into a wider trend of similar legislation in the Western world?
Well, of course it fits into a wider trend, not only in the Western world, but in Canada. I mean, Canadians are monitored as closely as U.S. citizens are, as closely as British citizens or any other. I mean, this is a global phenomenon. And the state, the corporate state, and Harper is a representative of corporate power in the corporate state, seeks this kind of control because they know what's coming with climate change and the inevitable financial collapse, which is looming now that global speculators are back on a spree as they were before 2008. And with a flick of a switch, essentially we have both the legal and physical mechanisms through the creation of massive security forces, militarized police forces, to, in essence, kind of declare a militarized state, both in Canada and the United States.
Right.
Or should we have another catastrophic act of domestic terrorism? I mean, anything like that. So all the mechanisms are there. It'll be almost instantaneous. So we have to fight it now.
So do you think that this bill will actually do anything towards its stated goal of combating terrorism?
Well, no, none of these bills are about terrorism. Terrorism is the excuse. That's what 9/11 was, and that's what this gunman who carried out this attack on Parliament Hill, I mean, they seized on that in the same way, for instance, the old Nazi party seized on the Reichstag fire to strip away civil liberties in Germany. And what people forget is that the next day, after the Nazis essentially eviscerated all civil liberties for the German population, everything appeared normal. Everybody went to work, came home, had dinner. But in fact, of course, the change was sudden. And as much as it happened, that they have ceded to themselves this kind of power in the name of fighting terrorism. And yet, for most people, there's a kind of normalcy, and they don't quite yet understand what a sea change this has been, and how dramatic this change is, and of course how terrifying it is. Totalitarian systems, whether go back and look at Stalin's, whether they creep forward because they have to break any kind of obstacles or opposition that lie in their path. And then by the time people grasp what's happened to them, it's kind of too late. There are no mechanisms left by which they can fight back. And that's kind of where we're headed. That's what's going on.
Right. So you mentioned civil disobedience, but in what ways can we combat this kind of surveillance? Or do you think there are any ways that we can really effectively do that at this point?
Well, I've spent a lot of time with Julian Assange, who believes in encryption up to a point. I mean, even Assange says finally the best encryptors, and he's one of them, will finally not be able to keep channels of privacy open. So he's kind of optimistic in the short term, but not in the long term. I don't encrypt. I mean, I think the mechanism, rather than trying to build a parallel encryption mechanism, I think what we have to do is carry out sustained and long-term acts of civil disobedience in order to try and force the state to back down. I think that's the only hope we have left. And I think that we have to build radical mass movements and radical alternative political parties. I don't trust, I see it with the Democrats. They will, under the Bush administration, decry the assault on civil liberties, but Obama's assault on civil liberties, in fact, has been far more egregious than that carried out by Bush. So I don't think the traditional political establishment has any intention. I can't speak for Canada, I'm not Canadian, but that is certainly true in the United States, that neither the Republicans or the Democrats have any intention of rolling any of this back. I've
seen that you've written a little bit about radicalization and how it really stems from sort of alienation from society and things like that.
Oh, right.
Yeah, do you think a bill like that could contribute to radicalization in Canada?
Of course it does, because what you do is you target a certain segment of the population, and Muslims have already been targeted in the United States and Canada for harassment and abuse and discrimination. Haven't done anything, and this breeds a kind of rage, especially among the young, who feel caught between two cultures already, and when they feel alienated from two cultures, and this feeds into the kind of propaganda that jihadists hand out, which is why you have roughly 20,000 foreign fighters with ISIS, three or 4,000 of them from Europe and Canada.
What would you propose as a way then of making sure that these people don't feel like they're alienated or isolated?
If people don't take away their rights, don't take away their right to privacy, don't take away their right to defense, don't take away, that a democracy is a functioning democracy is a mechanism by which reform, incremental and piecemeal reform, can be carried out. When you that mechanism, you inevitably radicalize, especially you're disenfranchised. So, in some ways, of course, this plays into the hands of the security, because those isolated acts of terror give the security state the excuse to turn the screws even tighter. So, when societies are polarized like that, and I saw it in the former Yugoslavia, which I covered the war, you have one extreme group playing off another extreme group. In the center, which is the mass of the ordinary people, are caught in between.
Is there anything that you want to add?
Only that if we don't win this fight, then we're going to cement into place a species of corporate totalitarianism, which will usher in a dystopia of terrifying proportions.
Okay.